They taught you Peter was the foundation. That is the story. Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, the man who walked on water and sank, the man who denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed, the man to whom Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." That is the foundation story of the Catholic Church, the bedrock of the Petrine succession, the reason there is a basilica in Rome with a 2,000-year-old tomb beneath its altar bearing Peter's name. I heard it from the time I was old enough to sit in a pew. I taught it in passing, in 35 years of history classes, every time I covered the Roman Empire and Christianity's rise. It was background, it was established, it did not require examination. And then I found saying 12. I was working through the Gospel of Thomas, one of the Nag Hammadi texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, buried in a sealed jar in the desert and not opened until 3 years after the war ended. I was reading it the way Spinoza taught, word by word, stripped of any tradition, letting the text speak for itself. And about a third of the way through, I stopped. The disciples asked Jesus a direct question. They say, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is to be our leader?" That is not a complicated question. It is the most important question anyone ever asked about what would happen after Jesus was gone, and Jesus answered it directly, with a name. He said, "Wherever you are to go to James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." James. Not Peter, not the 12 together, not a council, not a process, not a principle. A person. James. And the phrase that followed his name, "For whose sake heaven and earth came into being." That is not casual praise. That is a specific rabbinic formula of cosmic endorsement, the same language applied in Jewish tradition to the Torah itself, the same honor given to Moses. It is the highest possible thing you can say about a human being in the Jewish theological vocabulary Jesus was speaking. Jesus applied it to James. I have read thousands of verses. That one stopped me cold. Because here is what follows from that answer. An institution spent 17 centuries either ignoring it, explaining it away, or burying the text that contained it in a jar in the Egyptian desert so that no one would read it. And what I want to do today is show you exactly how that happened, why it happened, and what the documents, the ones that survived because someone chose to preserve them rather than burn them, actually say. This is not about tearing down Peter. Peter was who he was, and the documents are honest about him, including the unflattering parts. This is about what happens when an institution has every reason to need one story to be true, and every document that matters is quietly pointing in a different direction. Now let me tell you who James actually was, because the version most people carry is barely a sketch. The church taught you he was a minor figure, a background character. James, the brother of the Lord, one of several brothers mentioned in the Gospels, more or less off stage while the real drama happened. Maybe a little resistant at first. John 7:5 notes that his brothers did not believe in him, and then eventually a convert after the resurrection, one of the many leaders of the early church, important enough to mention, but not critical to the main story. That is the version. Here is what Hegesippus recorded, a 2nd century Jewish Christian historian writing in Jerusalem, whose account was preserved by Eusebius in the Historia Ecclesiastica. Hegesippus had access to oral traditions that were still living in his time, the memories of people who had known James personally. James was a Nazirite from birth. He drank no wine, ate no meat, cut his hair at no point. He wore only linen, never wool, which was the common material for clothing in 1st century Judea. He prayed so constantly, so prostrated on the stone floor of the temple, that the skin of his knees had hardened to the texture of a camel's knees. Hegesippus describes them, not metaphorically. The calluses were there, visible, physical evidence of a man who spent decades on his knees in that specific posture in that specific place. And here is the detail that lands hardest. James was permitted into the Holy of Holies to pray on behalf of the people. The Holy of Holies was the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most sacred space in all of Judaism. Only the high priest entered it, and only on Yom Kippur, after elaborate ritual purification. It was not a room most Jews ever entered. It was not a room most priests ever entered. James, a layman, not from the priestly line, was granted access to pray there. The Jerusalem priestly establishment, who did not grant this to just anyone, granted it to James. Think about what that means in terms of status. In first-century Jerusalem, among Jews who took the Torah seriously, that kind of access was not given to a peripheral figure. It was given to a man the community considered holy to a degree that overrode the normal rules of access. His title, Hatzadik, the just or the righteous, was not a church administrator's title. In Jewish tradition, a tzaddik was the foundational righteous person upon whom the existence of the world depended. The tradition held that in every generation there were 36 hidden righteous ones whose merit sustained creation. When the community called James Hatzadik, they were reaching for that register. And then there is Acts chapter 15. The Jerusalem Council, the first major doctrinal dispute in the early church, over whether Gentile converts needed to be circumcised and follow the Mosaic law. Peter speaks at this council. Paul speaks. Barnabas speaks. But it is James who delivers the final ruling. He summarizes the arguments, applies the scriptures, announces the decision, and dictates the letter that will be sent to the Gentile churches. He is running the meeting, not Peter. James. Now, someone will mention the other Jameses. There are at least 3 men named James in the New Testament: James, son of Zebedee, James, son of Alphaeus, and James, the brother of Jesus. The multiplicity of the name is real, but it also did something convenient for the tradition that came later. It kept the waters muddy. A quick survey of how James is discussed in most popular treatments of early Christianity will show you a kind of deliberate vagueness, a blurring of which James is being discussed, that does not look like innocent confusion. It looks like the kind of ambiguity that protects a story. Now stay with me, because this is the part I had to read twice before it fully landed. Galatians. Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia. Scholars date it to approximately 50 CE, the earliest surviving Christian document, earlier than Mark, earlier than any of the Gospels, the oldest written evidence we have of what early Christianity was doing and who was running it. Paul is writing this letter in frustration, defending his own authority and his understanding of the gospel against other teachers who had challenged him. He is not trying to give us a clear picture of the early church's power structure. He is not writing a historical record. He is writing in anger and self-defense. And in that self-defense, he accidentally left us the most revealing power map of the Jerusalem church that exists. Galatians 1:19. Paul is describing a visit to Jerusalem. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. Only James, not Peter plus James, not the 12, just James, and, as Paul notes, Peter. James is at the top of that list, Galatians 2:9. Paul describes the pillars of the Jerusalem church, James, Cephas, and John, in that order. James first, then Peter, then John. This is Paul's own witness. In the hierarchy of the Jerusalem church, as Paul understood it in 50 CE, James came before Peter. I need you to hear what that means. Paul was not a friend of James. Paul had theological disagreements with the Jerusalem church's position. He had every reason to minimize James's authority, and even Paul, writing in his own letter, lists James before Peter. Not diplomatically, just factually, as a man reporting the reality he encountered. And then there is Galatians 2:11 through 12. This is the passage that made me sit back in my chair and look at the ceiling for a while. Peter was in Antioch. He had been eating with Gentile Christians, sharing meals, sharing table fellowship in the free and open way that Paul advocated. And then something happened. When certain people came from James, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Read that one more time. Certain people came from James, men who represented James's position, James's authority, James's household. And Peter, the man whose statue stands today in St. Peter's Basilica, whose face is on every papal seal, the man Jesus supposedly called the rock upon which the church would be built, withdrew. He separated himself. He backed away from the table. Paul says he was afraid. Paul is furious about this. He calls Peter a hypocrite. He confronts him publicly. He is criticizing Peter's cowardice. But what Paul accidentally recorded while he was criticizing Peter's cowardice is something considerably more important than a theological disagreement. He recorded a power dynamic. A man who feared the arrival of James's delegates, not James himself, not even a direct order from James, just men who represented James's position and moved away from the table rather than face them. The first pope ran from James's messengers. That sentence is not my construction. It is what the text says. Paul wrote it in a letter that never left the canon, in a document that has been read aloud in churches every liturgical year for 2,000 years, without anyone stopping the service to ask, wait, why was Peter afraid of James's people? That fear is a power diagram. You are afraid of the people who represent someone only when that someone has authority over you. You do not withdraw from the table when people arrive who have no claim on your choices. Peter's behavior in Antioch tells you exactly where the authority actually sat in the Jerusalem church around 50 CE. It sat with James, not with Peter. And that is the most inconvenient single passage in the New Testament for the doctrine of Petrine supremacy, not because it is in some disputed Gnostic text, not because it requires specialized knowledge or manuscript hunting, because it is in Galatians, in your Bible, with Peter's name on the behavior. Let me show you the document that someone chose to bury in the ground rather than burn. The Apocryphon of James, Nag Hammadi Codex the Furos, the second tractate. Scholars date the text itself to somewhere between 100 and 150 CE, though it may preserve traditions older than the physical manuscript. The text presents itself as a letter from James recording private teachings that the risen Jesus gave specifically to James and Peter after the resurrection and before his final departure. In this document, James is given specific authority. He is given private instruction. And the commission that comes out of those private teachings is the commission to send the other apostles, to authorize the missionary work of the early church. James is not receiving a message to relay upward. He is receiving authority to distribute downward. One copy, one damaged copy, survived. Buried in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert, hidden sometime around the 4th century, most likely around 367 CE, the same year that Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, issued his 39th festal letter. That letter was the first complete list of what we now call the New Testament canon, 27 books. In it, Athanasius instructed the monasteries of Egypt to destroy all texts that were not on his list. And someone in a monastery in Upper Egypt, probably a monk, probably someone who had used and valued these texts, chose not to burn them. They chose instead to seal them in a jar and put them in the ground near the cliffs at Nag Hammadi. They were hiding them, hoping perhaps that someone would find them someday when it was safer. 52 documents survived that way, the Apocryphon of James among them. Here is the thing that stays with me about that. Burning a document is a declaration. This does not exist, this never happened, this is not to be remembered. Hiding it in the ground is something different. Hiding it is a kind of faith that the truth survives burial. Someone looked at Athanasius's order and could not bring themselves to destroy what they had been reading. They buried it instead. And they were right. 17 centuries later, someone found it. The Gospel of James was buried, literally, in a sealed jar, hidden from an institution that was in the middle of deciding what the early church would be allowed to remember about itself. And now, let me bring in the witness who had no theological stake in any of this. Josephus. Titus Flavius Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian who served Rome and wrote for a Roman audience. No allegiance to any Christian community. No interest in defending or attacking any Christian doctrine. Writing approximately 93 CE in his Antiquities of the Jews, he notes, as a passing reference in a political history, the execution of the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James. That single phrase tells you the status of James among non-Christian contemporaries. Josephus was writing for Romans. He identified Jesus in terms of James, not the other way around. James was apparently well enough known in the circles Josephus was writing for that the reference would land without elaboration. The execution itself is what Josephus is actually describing. High priest Ananus II had James brought before the Sanhedrin and condemned to be stoned. This happened in 62 CE, during a brief gap in Roman governance of the province. The previous procurator had just died, and the new one had not yet arrived. Ananus seized the window. The result was not what Ananus expected. Prominent Jerusalem Jews were outraged. They sent a formal delegation to the incoming Roman governor Albinus to report that Ananus had acted illegally. Albinus, Rome's new man in Judea, agreed. The execution was unauthorized under Roman provincial law, which required procuratorial approval for capital cases. Ananus was deposed. The king removed him from the high priesthood for the illegal execution. Hegesippus adds the tradition that Jerusalem's destruction followed directly from this. Immediately, Vespasian besieged them. The Roman siege that destroyed the city and the temple in 70 CE was understood in the memory of the Jerusalem Jewish community as the consequence of what was done to James. Now, you can dispute the theology of that claim. You can argue about causation and military history and Roman politics. But set that aside and look at what the political response tells you. Prominent Jews, non-Christian Jews, Jews with no investment in the Christian community, thought the execution of James was important enough to formally protest to Rome, and important enough that Rome agreed and removed the high priest who ordered it. Peripheral figures do not generate that kind of political aftermath. Institutions do not spend that kind of capital erasing marginal men. James generated that response because James was not marginal. And now let me show you what Spinoza saw. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE did not just destroy buildings, it destroyed an institution. The Jerusalem church, the community James had led, the people who had lived alongside James and Peter and the other disciples, who had first-hand memories of what actually happened after Jesus' death and in the years that followed. The living witnesses were gone. The physical community was scattered. The chain of oral transmission that connected the first generation to the second was broken in ways it could not fully recover from. The Gospels were written after 70 CE. Mark, the earliest, is dated to approximately 70 CE itself, right at the moment of the catastrophe. Matthew, Luke, and John follow in the subsequent decades. These documents were written by people who needed Roman tolerance to survive. The community that produced them was not in Jerusalem anymore. It was in places where Rome's goodwill mattered. Rome, Antioch, Ephesus. Spinoza, in chapter 17 of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, analyzed the relationship between political power and theological narrative with a precision that still cuts. His question was not theological. It was analytical. Who holds power? And what narrative does that power need to be true? The community that survived 70 CE and had the resources and stability to produce and preserve canonical texts was centered in Rome, not Jerusalem. The Petrine tradition was a Roman tradition. It placed the founder of the Roman Church at the apex of apostolic authority, made Rome the seat of that authority, and grounded the entire structure in a saying of Jesus that conveniently elevated the fisherman from Galilee over everyone else. The James tradition was a Jerusalem tradition. It belonged to a community that no longer had walls. Spinoza spent his life asking exactly this question. Not what a text says, but who benefits from this particular reading and what was eliminated to produce it. He applied this to Moses. He applied it to the Hebrew theocracy. He would have recognized this pattern in his sleep because he had lived its smaller version himself. In 1656, the Amsterdam Jewish community issued a cherem against him. Excommunication. He was 23 years old. His offense was reading the scriptures with the same directness and historical honesty that James's community had brought to their tradition. The institution that excommunicated Spinoza used the tools available to it: social exclusion, communal ostracism, commercial prohibition. Because it did not have Rome's sword, it used what it had. The Jerusalem church used what it had: memory, testimony, documents. The institution that outlasted it used what it had: survival, resources, and the Roman infrastructure of the late empire. Spinoza was excommunicated for threatening the institution's interpretive monopoly. James was erased from the succession narrative for the same reason. Both left documents. Both of those documents survived. One in a jar in the Egyptian desert, one in a house in The Hague. The institutions that tried to bury them are still here, so are the documents. I want to tell you about the last time I went to my old church's homecoming. I still go sometimes. Not every year, but some years. 22 years as a deacon leaves people in your life that you genuinely care about, and the homecoming is one of those occasions where you can see them without it being a theological negotiation. Good people. People I taught Sunday school with for a decade. People I sat with when their spouses were sick. That does not disappear, because your understanding of the texts changed. Last time I was there after the service, standing in the parking lot in the late afternoon, the kind of October afternoon in East Tennessee where the light comes through the maple trees at a low angle and everything looks like an old photograph. A friend of mine found me. Not the pastor, not anyone looking for a confrontation. A man I had taught Sunday school alongside for years. Someone I would still call a friend. A man of genuine faith and genuine warmth. He said, "Howard, I want to ask you something. Why do you keep going after Peter?" I did not answer right away. I stood there for a moment. I said, "I'm not going after Peter. I'm reading what Paul wrote about Peter." He shook his head slightly. Not in disagreement exactly, more like a man who has heard an answer he expected and finds it insufficient. He said something about how he hoped I found what I was looking for, and then he walked away toward his car. I drove home. I sat on the porch for a while after I got there, watching the light go off the ridge. Here is what I understood sitting there. He was not asking me to stop because he had a better argument. He had 22 years of shared Sunday school lessons to offer, and the accumulated weight of that sits on you differently than a theological point. The institution does not need arguments to protect its founding story. It has something more powerful than arguments. It has the feeling, the real, genuine feeling, of all the years you spent inside it, the weight of relationships, the cost of disappointing people you love. I know the documents are right. I know what Galatians 2:12 says. I know what saying 12 says. I know what survived in that jar for 17 centuries and what Athanasius ordered destroyed. Can I also know that walking away from that parking lot on an October afternoon, with the maples lit up gold, costs something that no document can fully account for? The institution protects its founding myth, not with arguments. It protects it with that weight, and the weight is real even when the documents are clear. Here is where I land. The question was asked once, directly, in a text that spent 17 centuries in the ground. Who is to be our leader? And Jesus named someone. The answer is there. It is in saying 12 of the Gospel of Thomas, which scholars of the period date, the textual tradition, not the physical manuscript, to somewhere between 40 and 70 CE. It is from the right era. It contains the right voice. The disciples asked, Jesus answered, and the answer was, go to James. Not the fisherman who would end up in Rome. The brother, the just one. The man whose knees were like a camel's from the years he spent on the floor of the temple. The man Paul named before Peter in his own letter. The man whose messengers Peter ran from in Antioch. The man Josephus recorded, without any Christian loyalty, without any theological stake, as someone whose illegal execution prompted the removal of a high priest. The debate the title of this video names is not really between Peter and James. The debate is between what the documents say and what the institution needed them to say. Paul was in Galatia when he wrote the letter. He was arguing about circumcision and Gentile converts. He was not trying to describe the Jerusalem church's power structure. He was trying to defend his own authority. And in defending his own authority, he wrote it down. James first, Peter deferring, the messengers from James arriving in Antioch, and a man backing away from his table. That is the document. It has been in your Bible since the 2nd century. Someone reads it aloud in church several times a year. Spinoza understood what it meant to follow buried evidence. He published his Tractatus without his name on it, without a city, with a fake publisher's imprint, because the last man who had written something like it had been found dead. He followed the primary sources wherever they led, even when the destination was the thing institutions had every reason to prevent. His ethics was nearly burned by the city of Amsterdam after his death. His publisher survived it by luck and speed. The Gospel of James was buried. Spinoza's ethics was almost burned. Some things survive because someone somewhere decided they were worth hiding in the ground, worth preserving in the hope that someone would eventually come along and read them without the 17 centuries of institutional interpretation sitting on top of them. That is what was in the jar at Nag Hammadi. That is what is in the letter to the Galatians, plain and visible, read aloud and not followed to its conclusion. Make of that what you will.